After winning the lottery, are people more happy or less happy a year later? Or equally, after having all their limbs amputated, are people more happy or less happy years later? All of our sounds, all of our senses are really being fed in to a brain which is enclosed in darkness in our skull and cannot see, hear or experience the world. It's merely getting a feed of data that represents that world through our senses in the best possible way that those senses can process the world and map it in. And who knows, each one of us could be perceiving the world in a radically different way. And here I am in Sea Point. The tide is out and it's exposed all these rocks, beautiful rocks around me, and I've just done a little bit of adventuring amongst the rock pools and going up and down rocks, and it's been a long time since I've done it. I've always loved it ever since I was a child, exploring, and I've done a few videos of exploring around the Dublin coastline, and they're in the channel here. And it's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful March day. It's uncharacteristically, unseasonally beautiful, and the calming sound of the sea behind me, it's got me thinking about the world inside our heads and the world outside, because I think that's what everything comes down to with regard to mental health. And I think that's where a lot of people make the mistake. They say, look, if somebody opens up about not being in good form, they say, look at all of the advantages you have, look at all the money you have, all the skills you have, all of this stuff, you've got a great house and a car and all these kind of things, in order to try and cheer them up. And I think and that may be true, and I think it exposes the main flaw, and what governs our mental health is that there are two worlds. There is the actual world that's happening around us, and then there is a world internal to us which we're living that experience through. And I think there's a massive gulf of the difference between the two. Sometimes they can be quite close, but I think most often there's a massive chasm between how we're living that world within us through our senses and our thoughts, and how that world is in actuality outside of us. Now that comes down to a fundamental question which I've been thinking about as well, is that there is a lot of talk about, is the world a simulation? And is all of this just a giant computer game that some higher species has created? And really, ultimately, life is a simulation. There's no doubt about that, in that our perception of the world is a mere simulation of what's going on outside of us. From a purely biological point of view, everything that we hear goes into our ears and it's processed into electrical signals, which are merely representation of what those sounds are, an electrical version representation of what that vibration is. And then everything we see, similarly, is carried through the nervous system in terms of current, tiny little currents, and that creates a representation in our neural network as to what that is. And similarly, all of our sounds, all of our senses are really being fed in to a brain which is enclosed in darkness in our skull and cannot see, hear or experience the world. It's merely getting a feed of data that represents that world through our senses in the best possible way that those senses can process the world and map it in. And who knows, each one of us could be perceiving the world in a radically different way. It's certain that we all are perceiving the world in a different way, but it could be incredibly radical. Some people could be seeing a green sky behind me, but they call it blue, but it looks totally different. They might hear sounds totally differently, but we've no way of conveying that to each other, because the processing, by the means of the processing, the original data is just destroyed. There's no such thing as the original data. It's purely processed before it's put into our head, and a map and a representation of what's going on around us is fed in. So the whole world is a simulation. The world that we're experiencing in our minds is a simulation of what's going out there. And all the filters that we have, I'm referring to neuro-linguistic programming, and I've talked about that in other videos as well. all of the filtering that we do with our beliefs and values are further processing that in terms of deleting stuff that we don't believe in and only focusing on things that we do. And then there's the reticular activation system, the RAS, which is sorting for the most important things that we're looking for out there. So if we're interested in beauty, then we'll see all of that all around us here in nature. If we like the beautiful sounds, if we like people more than nature, we'll hear the sounds of people in the distance and focus. And really, so everything is a representation and a map, really, of what's going on around us. But so we do live two worlds. One is the world around us, and then the world within us, which is a mere representation of that. And for most of us, those two worlds are different. Almost all of us, really. But for many of us, those worlds diverge, and we can be living a fantastic life externally, and we can have everything materially, and not just materially, but other issues as well, like other fantastic things like friendships and things like that. But then if we're living a dark world inside in our heads, then that's what governs our mental state. And therein lies the problem, that you can transport yourself to a new part of the world, you can change jobs, you can change your career, you can change the things that you're doing, but really it's inside in your head that you're experiencing life, and that's where the change has to come, which takes a lot longer. And I found that fascinating study about people who won the lottery and people who are amputees. And the fantastic thing about it is that what they found years later is that the people who won the lottery were no more happier than they were before they won the lottery. The people who were amputees were no less happy than they were before they were amputees. In fact, people were exactly the same in terms of their mental health, in terms of their outlook on life. And it's not surprising, because if you win the lottery, then it's a massive, and this is why the study is so useful, is because it's a massive dramatic change externally. And the idea is, will that translate internally? And the answer is no. So it's a massive dramatic change, a real jolt to your external circumstances, but really nothing has changed within you. So your mental state hasn't changed in the slightest. Nothing externally has happened to your mental state. And because of that, you tend to find your set point, and your set point just will overrule any of the external environments. So people are no happier after having won €1 million a couple of years later, because they're living the same life inside in their head, and that has not changed regardless of the external change that's happened. And similarly with the opposite direction, with amputees, that something dramatically bad has happened, but they're still living the same life inside in their head, and they have held on to that, whether better or for worse. And I suppose the lesson is that all change has to happen internally, and that is a more complex journey, certainly for me. And I've certainly felt that I've certainly come to that slow realization of that fact myself through life. I remember being promoted once, and it was a massive event because there was only a few of us promoted at work, and I was really honoured and everything else. And I remember looking at the slip that said I was promoted and feeling miserable. And I think the reason I felt more miserable was the fact that I thought that this would make me feel fantastic, and it didn't. And the fact that it didn't made me feel even more miserable, because I thought, what the hell then is wrong with me if this isn't going to improve my mental state? And really it was because nothing had changed internally. I didn't have the same acceptance of myself, didn't have the same internal, it's our own internal sense of acceptance and self-love, really, that governs how much we love ourselves and how much we will enjoy life. And equally the other way, I mean, I've had some awful things that have happened, and they didn't necessarily change it in the external world. They didn't necessarily change what was happening inside. So the answer is, how do we tackle the internal map that we have of the world? And a lot of that is down to, well, hypnosis is one of the keys to that. And one of the reasons hypnosis is so effective is because it's about bombarding our mind with imagery that talks to our minds in our own mind's language, by presenting images that make no sense perhaps to the conscious mind, but that deeply embed stories that work for us and motivate us on the internal level. So it's that hypnosis, and we're subject to hypnosis all the way through life, every day, through the saturation of images that we see on television, through war and pestilence and disease, or else through images of positivity and happiness. And it's a question of which we select for, really. So it's one of the biggest challenges in life, that we have two lives, the one we're living out there and the one that's going on inside our head. Let me know in the comments if you have experienced that, and a divergence between those two images of life, and how you've encountered it. And please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.